And some began to say in the press, talk about the threats that were out. What would happen to me from some of our six white brothers. But I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like everybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. You can accept it. You will leave those.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to my friends for working in the program. Tribute to Dr. King, Jr. My name is Michael Hecht. One of the first things I'd like to talk about is the photo. I love that photo when I came across it 25, 30 years ago, and as I got older, I look at that photo and I see the weight and the cost of what it took for this couple to do what they did. As soon as he took the mantle for the civil rights movement, he was aware that he was never going to see his children graduate college, go to their weddings, see any of them. Coretta knew it also. He was a middle-class family upbringing. She was a sharecropper's family. He was offered at the time $100,000 to go teach at Howard University. One of the reasons he says in his autobiography that finally sealed the deal for him to take the mantle is he came home one day and his daughter came running to him, said, "Daddy, I want to show you something." And there was a commercial about an amusement park. And he said, "Daddy, when can we go?" And Dr. King knew that blacks weren't allowed at that amusement park. And it was one of those things that sealed the deal for him. And he knew that at any cost, he would do it for his children and the children living and the future. And as a child, Dr. King, already the seeds were there. And through the years, when I talk about different artists, whether they're writers, musicians, painters, sometimes you have to just look when they were young and the people that surrounded them. And you start to see, I always tell people, artwork is like a flower. You gotta plant the seeds, and then at any time, it'll blossom. So let's just listen to Dr. King talk about some of the important seeds that made him and developed a fire inside of him. He talks about going to a shoe store in Atlanta with his dad. And the clerk comes over and says, "I'll be happy to wait on you if you'll just move to those seats to the rear." My dad said, "There's nothing wrong with these seats. We're quite comfortable here." "Sorry," said the clerk, "but you'll have to move. We'll either buy shoes sitting here," my father said, "or we won't buy shoes at all." Whereupon my dad took me by the hand and walked out of the store. This was the first time I had seen Dad so furious. That experience revealed to me at a very early age that my father had not adjusted to the system, and he played a great part in shaping my conscience. I still remember walking down the street beside him as he muttered, "I don't care how long I have to live with this system, I will never accept it." And my dad never has. I remember riding with him another day when he accidentally drove past the stop sign. A policeman pulled up to the car and said, "All right, boy, pull over and let me see your license." My dad instantly said, "Let me make it clear to you that you aren't talking to a boy. If you persist in referring to me as boy, I will be forced to act as if I don't hear a word you are saying." The policeman was so shocked in hearing a Negro talk to him so forthrightly that he didn't quite know how to respond. He nervously wrote the ticket and left the scene as quickly as possible. Dr. King Jr. says there was a pretty strict system of segregation in Atlanta. For a long, long time, I could not go swimming until there was a Negro YMCA. A Negro child in Atlanta could not go to any public park. I could not go to the so-called white schools. In many of the stores downtown, I couldn't go to a lunch counter to buy a hamburger or a cup of coffee. I could not attend any of the theaters. There were 1 or 2 Negro theaters, but they didn't get any of the main pictures. If they did get them, they got them 2 or 3 years later. I remember another experience I used to have in Atlanta. I went to high school on the other side of town, to the Booker T. Washington High School. I had to get the bus in what was known as the 4th Ward and ride over to the west side. In those days, rigid patterns of segregation existed on the buses, so that Negroes had to sit in the backs of buses. Whites were seated in the front, and often, if whites didn't get on the buses, those seats were still reserved for whites only, so Negroes had to stand over empty seats. I would end up having to go to the back of that bus with my body, but every time I got on that bus, I left my mind up on the front seat, and I said to myself, one of these days I'm going to put my body up there where my mind is. When I was 14, I traveled from Atlanta to Dublin, Georgia with a dear teacher of mine, Mrs. Bradley. I participated in an oratorical contest there, and I succeeded in winning the contest. My subject, ironically enough, was the Negro and the Constitution. That night, Mrs. Bradley and I were on a bus returning to Atlanta. Along the way, some white passengers boarded the bus, and the white driver ordered us to get up and give the whites our seats. We didn't move quickly enough to suit him, so he began cursing us. I intended to stay right in that seat, but Mrs. Bradley urged me up, saying we had to obey the law. We stood up in the aisle for 90 miles to Atlanta. That night will never leave my memory. It was the angriest I have ever been in my life. New York Times, February 24th, 1956. He says, "There are those who would try to make of this a hate campaign. This is not war between the white and the Negro, but a conflict between justice and injustice. This is bigger than the Negro race revolting against the white. We are seeking to improve not the Negro of Montgomery, but the whole of Montgomery. If we are arrested every day, if we are exploited every day, if we are trampled over every day, don't ever let anyone pull you so low as to hate them. We must use the weapon of love. We must have compassion and understanding for those who hate us. We must realize so many people are taught to hate us that they are not totally responsible for their hate. But we stand in life at midnight. We are always on the threshold of a new dawn." One of my favorite excerpts is this one I'll read from his statement at the 16th Street Baptist Church. In the mornings, I'm driving 51 to Stoughton from Madison, and of course we've all experienced it. God bless the other drivers. As they're coming towards you, they have their brights on. And so let me read to you Dr. King's statement. "The reason I can't follow the old eye for an eye philosophy is that it ends up leaving everybody blind. Somebody must have sense, and somebody must have religion. I remember some years ago, my brother and I were driving from Atlanta to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and for some reason, the drivers that night were very discourteous, or they were forgetting to dim their lights. And finally, my brother looked over at me and he said, 'I'm tired of this, Martin, and the next car that comes by here and refuses to dim the lights, I'm going to refuse to dim mine.' I said to my brother, 'Wait a minute, don't do that. Somebody has to have some sense on this highway, and if somebody doesn't have sense enough to dim the lights, we'll all end up destroyed on this highway.' And I'm saying the same thing for us here in Birmingham. We are moving up a mighty highway toward the city of freedom. There will be meandering points. There will be curves and difficult moments, and we will be tempted to retaliate with the same kind of force that the opposition will use. But I'm going to say to you, wait a minute, Birmingham. Somebody's got to have some sense in Birmingham." So lots of times I think in metaphors, and one of them is we have the fire developing within Dr. King Jr., and I often think of this lady as the making of the candle. This is from The Days of Martin Luther King Jr. by Jim Bishop, and I'll read you this excerpt. The driver looked. All the seats were filled. A few whites stood up front. All right, he said, looking at Mrs. Parks and two other blacks. Come on, get in the back. Rosa Parks looked up at the strong white man at her side, waiting. 3 blacks got up and walked in the back. Get out of that seat, the driver said, pointing at Mrs. Parks. The driver, all he saw was a small, dark woman with a circlet of braids and a glint of light from her glasses. No, she said, I won't. Rosa Parks was not frightened. She had been secretary of the local NAACP chapter for years, and she was attuned to race relations and knew the difference between the loud and the ominous. This threat was ominous. Conversely, the bus driver seemed to understand that this black woman was one who was going to sit there just to defy him. So he yanked the ratchet on the emergency brake, ducked under the steel bar, and left to look for a policeman. Suddenly the chatter stopped. All the birds, dark and light inside that bus, fell silent. They knew what he had said. They knew what she had said. There was seldom a confrontation except once in a while between an intoxicated Negro and a surly driver. This was different. An apparently gentle person, one who might wear gloves as a habit, had given the driver a flat no, and there was nothing he could do except call a policeman. If the word got around Montgomery that a small woman had successfully defied a big white brute of a man on the Cleveland Avenue bus, well, this would not be December 1st, 1955. It would be Hallelujah Day all over the city. September 15, 1963, the Birmingham Baptist Church was bombed and 4 African-American girls were killed. And Dr. King Jr. came to give the eulogy. And I want to read to you a part of it. So in spite of the darkness of this hour, we must not despair. We must not become bitter, nor must we harbor the desire to retaliate with violence. We must not lose faith in our white brothers. Somehow we must believe that the most misguided among them can learn to respect the dignity and worth of all human personality. May I now say a word to you, the members of the bereaved families. It is almost impossible to say anything that can console you at this difficult hour and remove the deep clouds of disappointment which are floating in your mental skies. But I hope you can find a little consolation from the universality of this experience. Death comes to every individual. There is an amazing democracy about death. It is not an aristocracy for some of the people, but a democracy for all of the people. Kings die and beggars die. Rich men die and poor men die. Old people die and young people die. Death comes to the innocent and it comes to the guilty. Death is the irreducible common denominator of all men. I hope you can find some consolation from Christianity's affirmation that death is not the end. Death is not a period that ends the great sentence of life, but a comma that punctuates it to more lofty significance. Death is not a blind alley that leads the human race into a state of nothingness, but an open door which leads man into life eternal. Let this daring faith, this great invincible surmise, be your sustaining power during these trying days. Again from Days of Dr. King Jr. by Jim Bishop. Dr. King Jr. is at a book signing, and a woman says, "Are you Luther King?" And he says, "Yes." And she takes out a letter opener and stabs him in the heart. The doctor, in fact, when he was stabbed, the letter opener, there's a black and white photo of it. You can see the handle sticking out. And one of the store employees goes to take it out, and he was able to gesture, don't touch it. Because he had a feeling that if he removed it, he was going to die. And she stopped. The ambulance came, he went to the hospital, and Jim Bishop writes, Dr. Noslario and his assistants were in all likelihood more frightened than Dr. King. They realized that since the point of the dagger had missed the heart, if he sneezed, it would mean sudden death. An operating room was prepared. The mere taking of x-rays required caution. The doctor examined the wet plates. His fear became fact. The point of the blade was leaning against the outer wall of the aorta, the huge vessel which carries the blood from the heart to the rest of the body. A cough or sudden movement could kill the pastor. The operation required 3 hours of delicate work. When the patient was anesthetized, the doctor removed the rib section to give himself room. Next, he had to watch the pulsing of the aorta so he could grasp the blade and begin to withdraw it as the aorta contracted. Nurses mopped perspiration from medical brows. The shiny tip came away easily and was carefully drawn from the chest. The little dent in the aorta was clear. King was examined for lung puncture. Under the diffusing beams of an overhead light, he was sutured and sent to a private room. He would live. Dr. King Jr. goes down to Memphis to support the sanitation workers. He never had a good feeling about it. Dr. Ralph Abernathy and Andrew Young reported that he was always uneasy. The first time they went down there, after they conducted their business and planned the marches, he asked them, let's leave as soon as we can. They march in Memphis, and during the march, they don't quite know who did what, who started what, but police and marchers got into it. One person was fatally wounded, and Dr. King was emotionally distraught. He was a great follower of Gandhi. As a college man, it was one of his heroes, and his belief in nonviolence was paramount to his cause. And so they returned back to the motel, and he's in his sport jacket or suit, what he wore that day, totally depressed about the situation. He feared that the media would make much of it and start to say, well, see, Dr. King leads violent marches. And so he was quite worried about the impact of this failed march. And he looks at Reverend Abernathy and he says, I can't make that speech tonight. Ralph, you're going to have to go for me. And they were pretty much like blood brothers. And Ralph knew when Dr. King really meant it, that he just couldn't do it. So he said, okay, Martin, I'll go. It's pouring rain that night. And Ralph Abernathy talks about they're in the car and they're driving towards the church. And all of a sudden, they're close to the church, and there's hundreds and hundreds of people outside the church in the pouring rain. The church was filled. They put loudspeakers outside the church so the people in the streets could hear him. Ralph Abernathy runs to a phone, calls up, says, "Martin, you have to come. People are coming to hear you, not me. You must come." And Dr. King talks about that he understood also what Ralph was saying, and he knew that he had to come. Never changed his clothes, came, put on his raincoat, came down to the church, and as he walked down the aisle, people that were right in the end of the pews and people that might have had to come over, the one thing many of them wanted to do was just touch him. Just touch him. And so he goes to the podium that night, and I'll give you an excerpt from that great speech. They allowed me to read some of the mail that came in, and from all over the states and the world, kind letters came in. I read a few of them, but one of them I will never forget. I had received one from the president and the vice president. I've forgotten what those telegrams said. I'd received a visit and a letter from the governor of New York, but I've forgotten what that letter said. But there was another letter that came from a little girl, a young girl who was a student at the White Plains High School. And I looked at the letter, and I'll never forget it. It said simply, "Dear Dr. King, I am a 9th grade student at the White Plains High School," she said. "While it should not matter, I would like to mention that I'm a white girl. I read in the paper of your misfortune and of your suffering, and I read that if you had sneezed, you would have died. And I'm simply writing to you to say that I'm so happy that you didn't sneeze. I want to say that I too am happy that I didn't sneeze. Because if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1960 when students all over the South started sitting in at lunch counters. And I knew that as they were sitting in, they were really standing up for the best in the American dream and taking the whole nation back to those great wells of democracy, which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1961 when we decided to take a ride for freedom and ended segregation and interstate travel. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1962 when Negroes in Albany, Georgia decided to straighten their backs up. And whenever men and women straighten their backs up, they are going somewhere, because a man can't ride your back unless it is bent. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been here in 1963 when the people of Birmingham, Alabama aroused the conscience of this nation and brought into being the Civil Rights Bill. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have had a chance later that year in August to try to tell America about a dream that I had had. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been down in Selma, Alabama to see the great movement there. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been in Memphis to see a community rally around their brothers and sisters who are suffering. I'm so happy that I didn't sneeze. I left Atlanta this morning, and as we started on the plane, there were 6 of us. The pilot said over the public address system, "We are sorry for the delay, but we have Dr. Martin Luther King on the plane. And to be sure that all of the bags were checked, and to be sure that nothing would be wrong on the plane, we had to check out everything carefully. And we've had that plane protected and guarded all night." And then I got into Memphis, and some began to say the threats, or talk about the threats that were out, or what would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind, like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. So come full circle, we talked about some of the moments in his life that he saw. And I think this speech, more than any speech, I think if I was lucky enough to have Dr. King across the coffee table from me, I would say, it sounds to me like it's almost a tribute to your dad. This is called a drum major for righteousness. Dr. King says, every now and then I guess we all think realistically about that day when we will be victimized with what is life's final common denominator. That's something we call death. We all think about it, and every now and then I think about my own death, and I think about my own funeral. And I don't think of it in a morbid sense. Every now and then I ask myself, what is it that I once said? And I leave the word to you this morning. I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want you to say that day that I tried to be right on the war question. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try to feed the hungry. And I want you to be able to say that day that I did try in my life to clothe those who were naked. I want you to say on that day that I did try in my life to visit those who were in prison. I want you to say that I tried to love and to serve humanity. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness. And all of the other shallow things will not matter. I won't have any money to leave behind. I won't have the fine and luxurious things of life to leave behind. But I just want to leave a committed life behind. And that's all I wanted to say. If I can help somebody as I pass along, if I can cheer somebody with a word or song, if I can show somebody he's traveling wrong, then my living will not be in vain. If I can do my duty as a Christian ought, if I can bring salvation to a world once wrought, if I can spread the message as the Master taught, then my living will not be in vain. On behalf of my fellow participants, it's been an honor and a privilege to present this tribute, and thanks everybody for coming. Thank you.